Welcome, everyone, to the Bonner Institute's webinar. And today I'd like to introduce Gordon Rudd, a wonderful colleague who has presented his expertise through the Bonner Institute webinar series in the past. We encourage you to look at his prior recording, and he's going to be invited many times in the future. Today, our topic is the Chief Information Security Officer's Guide to Cultivating Board Support. I would like to note this topic is always timely, but in particular, EY just released a survey indicating the distance and differences between the perception of boards of directors and chief information security officers regarding the cybersecurity threat landscape, the budget that needs to be allocated to cybersecurity solutions, and the autonomy that the chief information security officer needs to make decisions quickly and efficiently to protect the organization. Gordon Rudd has deep expertise and experience in presenting to boards as a chief information security officer. Gordon today advises organizations across the world in how to beef up their security operations. And Gordon, I'm going to enable you to share your screen, and I'd like to ask you to please introduce yourself and provide more information, and I will go on mute, although I might have some questions during this presentation.
Absolutely. Well, I'm Gordon. I've been doing technology for 40 years and cybersecurity for 25. And over my career, I've had an opportunity to present to boards since the late 1980s. I don't know that some of you would consider that an opportunity more than some kind of a pain point within your career, but it teaches you a couple of things. One is the view that the board has, and that's really what we want to do here. You know, I've worked with over 15,000 individuals to teach them how to become CISOs over the years, but I have recently transitioned into being somebody that's trying to teach boards as well as the chief information security officers how they need to work together. And of course, as John pointed out, that's become increasingly more effective over the years, which, you know, that's really kind of where we are today, trying to do something that very few people are doing correctly. In fact, statistically, less than 1% of the organizations that you see today are actually using the appropriate techniques to make sure they're managing their risk and their money correctly. First, let's take a look at the CISO's role. The CISO's role in any organization is capsulized like this. This is what you're going to see from any CISO. And the most important box on this screen is the risk management one. GRC is really important, but you've got to make sure that you're hitting the risk really hard, really, really hard. The board's role, on the other hand, is a lot different. They have these duties and responsibilities, and they need to ensure appropriate leadership as well as be available to the company. If you look at what the board is doing with cybersecurity, they've got to make sure that they're creating a business critical issue here. They've got to make sure that they're not only taking care of the GRC, but again, the risk management component is the biggest component right here, right now, that we need to deal with. If you look at obstacles to the board that the board may face during a cybersecurity change or some kind of cybersecurity, and we call it a cybersecurity change because the 1% that are taking care of cybersecurity correctly and managing it correctly, we need to make sure that everybody is doing it and that we're going through this change together, you know, that being the CISOs and the board. We're going through this to try and make sure that every single person has the ability to have visibility into what the board's thinking and what your cybersecurity team's doing. And that dual visibility is really kind of critical. And you have to realize boards, they differ vastly by industry. So whatever industry you're in, you're going to have a specific board. Oil and gas boards are very different than healthcare boards. You know, if you look at healthcare boards, they're almost always a bunch of physicians, and then the people that have whoever's endowing that particular hospital sitting on the board. So it's radically different for everybody, and everybody brings their own lens to the table. It always, the view that you have through the lens that you have is always, always, always going to be impacted first and foremost by where the chief information security officer reports. If they are reporting to the CEO, you know, that's good, but they also need to be a member of the audit committee. They also need to be in the tech ops committee and the risk management committee. Compliance is something that they normally sit on as well. Those are all, again, committees of the board. And as you all know, a committee of the board is appointed by the board, and you are individually appointed to the committee by the board. So you don't have a normal level of fiduciary responsibility when you hit those committees. When you're a member of that committee, you take on the duties and responsibilities and the fiduciary level of excellence that any board member would have. And if you forget that, that doesn't work out well. It never works out well. And again, one size does not fit all. You've got to look at some kind of a capability maturity model index to determine where the organization is, because that's going to inform how you work with the board. If it's a small company, the board's going to be probably three people that can have lunch together. But on the other hand, if you're a larger company, if you're a 4 on any index, you're going to have a real board. You're going to have real standards that are organization wide. You're going to have GRC. It's a completely different board presentation that you're going to be doing. And that means that you've got to take a leadership role. If you want to be a CISO, you got to be a leader. That's just all there is to it. This particular chart, if you look at the very bottom of the chart, down here with budgeting and resources, I put that at the bottom because that's really the foundation that you should be standing on. You need to stand on dollars and cents, okay? That's all budget and resource allocation. Everything else, incident response, team leadership, risk management, collaboration with other departments, all lead you to a point that you can actually be the strategic leader that you want to be. And the board's leadership role is really not that different, but it's just kind of turning the Rubik's Cube around a little bit. They're always going to look at governance and strategy, and they're always going to look at their accountability and incident response. You notice incident response keeps showing up. I promise you that if you take the Fortune 2500 and take a look at their board per se, they're not participating in incident response or incident resilience. They're expecting the C-level suite, the C-suite, as we call it, to do that. And to be
Gordon, could
honest
I,
with you, the C-suite normally doesn't do that. They, for
Gordon,
whatever reason, don't believe that they should do that. So they'll assign the CIO and the CISO and everybody under them to take a look at the incident response, but they don't want to get involved. That's unfortunate because incident response is really where you're going to lose a lot of money if you don't know how to do it correctly. And again, if you look at the very bottom, budget and resource allocation is the foundation that that board's going to stand on. Everybody's interested in the dollars. If you look at a CISO sphere of influence, they've got other cyber leaders, their team, the lines of business, their internal clients and external clients. But do they have the senior management team? Does the senior management team allow them to have some influence? Does the board of directors allow them to have some influence? You know, and that's really the thing you've got to look at. Are you able to include senior management, or the C-suite as we call it, and the board of directors in your sphere of influence? If you're not, you've got to do something. You've got to take some steps to change that. You've got to educate your board. You know, the first thing you've got to realize is you're an educator, because 99% of all the people that sit on boards today don't know anything about cybersecurity or the nuts and bolts of it, or risk management, or even risk calculations. So what I try and get everybody to do is use the old psychology of cybersecurity board reporting. And that really is the same thing as you see in healthcare. Watch one, do one, teach one. You should be preparing a report, especially if you're in a large organization, for someone else to deliver to the board. And you just answer questions to the presenter. You don't ever get FaceTime with the board. And after those reports start coming in and you learn what they need to look like, how they need to be formatted, and the structure of the report, then you get to sit on the sidelines. And if you ever have heard the phrase, I want a seat at the table, that's what they're talking about. Board members sit around the table. Okay. All the ancillary players sit around the wall. They're literally sitting on the sidelines, kind of thing. So you should then be sitting on the sidelines and answer any questions about the report that you've presented, because somebody else is going to be presenting it, or that you've prepared, somebody else is going to present. And then you get to, after you understand the board and you get familiar with them, they get familiar with you, you understand the reporting dynamics and what they want to see and what they don't want to see, you get to deliver a report to the board. And I'll give you a good example of why you want to do that. I'm presenting to the board and I'm showing them a risk assessment. And the last category here is, if we don't do this, we could have a catastrophic failure. And the chief operating officer just came out of his chair. It's like, oh my God, don't say that. It's like, don't say what? What part of that am I missing? Don't ever say catastrophic failure. And for whatever reason, that chief operating officer did not like the fact that we might have a catastrophic failure. You know, he didn't want that to be any part of any board minutes whatsoever, that there's a possibility of a catastrophic failure. So you've got to adapt, but you don't know that unless you take your time to watch and get and learn. You're learning as well as teaching. And the old saying of how do you communicate with anybody in terms they're going to understand. You've got to have terms that the board members understand. And this is a good example of how a board relates. XYZ organization's expected loss is greater than the industry average. 220 million is XYZ's expected loss. The industry average is 100 to 145 million. So then you get to present a plan to bring the organization, as a brief plan, brief. You don't ever get long-winded. You need to present a brief plan on how to get the organization down to the industry average, and why aren't we at the industry average, those kinds of things. And you need to look at the contents of that report, your plan, your risk levels, threats, risk quantification. We're going to touch on risk quantification a little more here. Potential cost of a breach, regulatory issues, compliance issues, any new technology. AI is a new technology that we have not seen weaponized yet. But if you think about it, I can go on the dark web and for about $1,000, I can buy software that will create malware. And it'll create malware for any platform in the world. It'll even armor it against all known anti-malware software, all endpoint software. Great, I've got that. Now, how do I deploy it? Well, if you start using AI in conjunction with a piece of software like that, you can see how very quickly things can get out of hand, and you can very easily be a victim of ransomware or something even worse. So those types of things you've got to watch in the technology, okay? When you structure the report, I always like them structured like this. You want to give them an executive summary, current threat landscape, security risk posture, and you want to make sure that in the incident response and security operations phase, you're letting the board know who's participating in your incident response tabletops, who's participating in your exercises, okay? If the senior management team is staffing it out, the board needs to be aware. And you've got to be very careful how you present this, but you've got to somehow or other slide in that, you know, your senior management team, it talks a good game, but they're not walking the walk. They're just talking the talk. And of course, you've got to look at everything else, including your key metrics and your KPIs. If you don't have your key performance indicators nailed down for cybersecurity, fire up ChatGPT or any one of the, gosh, 50 or so AI engines that are available to you today and ask for cybersecurity KPIs. They'll give them to you, and then you've got to tailor them to your organization. But it's easy to find what those KPIs should be, and you should be tailoring your report to the ones that matter most to your board. Okay. And you always want to use dollars and cents. You always want to communicate risk in numbers. You always want to have metrics, whether it's KPIs, KPCs, whatever. You always want to have your summary reports. And you always, 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 with the board, you always summarize everything. That doesn't mean that you get to get away with an 8x10 glossy. Excuse me. You've got to be able to drill down, and you've got to be able to do it on the fly. If somebody challenges some number in your summary, you've got to show them how that was crafted, where it came from. But your presentation is going to start at the tip of the iceberg, and you're going to allow the board to do a Q&A to get you to drill down. And these are the reports. These 5 reports are what you should be really summarizing, or 5 areas: the program status, your priorities, what projects you have going, vendor aging. Vendor management is a cybersecurity issue, period, paragraph. Next. And your performance. What does your security ops look like? How's it performing as an organization? And every organization, the very first thing you need to do if you're going to calculate risk is find out what your risk appetite statement is. I only know of 2 or 3 organizations in the Fortune 2500 that have a formal board-approved risk appetite statement. But on the other hand, every organization has one. If you're the CISO, I always encourage you to ask, do we have a board-approved risk appetite statement? It would usually come from the audit committee, okay? And your answer is probably going to be no. What is that? And that risk appetite statement is just, well, how much of a loss are you willing to tolerate before we need to start building in risk management issues, risk mitigation tactics, so that we don't have that loss. And I say every organization has one, even if they don't know it. Ask the CFO in any organization what a material loss is. And he or she'll pop up a number so quick it'll make your head spin. That is absolutely the risk appetite of the organization. Whatever the CFO considers a material loss is how much the organization's willing to lose and write it off and say, yeah, no big deal, versus, we need to figure out a way not to lose that money. And that's really the crux of that risk appetite statement. And a lot of organizations will tell you that risk management costs too much, takes too long, can't be measured. And it's like, these are myths. None of these are true. These are all statements that organizations will make, usually around the C-suite, to try and say, we don't really need to do risk management in depth. And I would submit to you that if we're not doing risk management in depth in a technology environment, you're going to have some problems because you're not going to understand things in a way that you can. And you can use things like this common vulnerability scoring system. And if you look at the timeline on it, we're off on the right-hand side. In 2023, they came out with CVSS version 4. And that really has a lot more detail in it. To be honest, when it first came out in 2005, it was a great idea, but it didn't have any teeth. And in 2019, it started to get some teeth. It started to drill down enough to have enough granularity that it really became functional. It got a lot better in 2023. And they also have patterns in the CVSS for you to integrate with any NIST or ISO framework. They also show you how to integrate a FAIR system, which is factor analysis of information risk. FAIR is just another cybersecurity risk quantification framework. It absolutely gets you today to be very granular. And that granularity you can see coming out in every framework. NIST is getting more granular. ISO came out with a new granular framework. we're getting down to the point that these frameworks can actually be used to get a risk number. And that's really what you're after. When you look at risk and quantifying them, you need to start somewhere. And we always try and get everybody to start on something like this, where you can see, okay, if it's an insignificant risk and it's going to happen, you know, has a probability of occurrence greater than 70%. If you look at your insignificant risk and your 70% up here, then you come up with a 5. It's just really kind of simple math. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, almost certain, insignificant to catastrophic. There's that catastrophic word that the COO didn't like. These, these types of granular calculations need to be applied to all your vulnerabilities. Now, when you stop and think about it, the first time that I ran some software on a medium-sized bank that had about just south of 900 employees, we got just south of 90 million pieces of software and pieces of equipment that were on that network. But when we drilled down, we found that since we were, since we were running an IBM mainframe and we were using an old green screen system still, the endpoints didn't have to be updated as regularly as one would like. And of course, being a bank and being very frugal, the senior management team didn't want to update that hardware out there because it had some significant costs. So every piece of hardware that was out in the field that did nothing but run green screen had 16 versions of Adobe Reader on it, even the ones that had known vulnerabilities. So we had to come up with a plan, which thankfully enough, their core system provider was transitioning from green screens to software that looks just exactly like what you're seeing on the screen today. And we were able to go in and say, okay, we've got to replace these endpoints anyway, because they don't have enough horsepower to run a Microsoft software system. So gosh, we're just going to have to bite the bullet and get it done. And we were able to do that, but that took the number of vulnerabilities down from about 90 million on there to about 16,000 that we had to address. Most of them were already being addressed, but those numbers shock people when you hear them, but especially if nobody's run a vulnerability scan on your network so that you know what those vulnerabilities are. And every time you think about those vulnerabilities, you want to translate that vulnerability into a defined risk. You want that defined risk to relate to revenue. We always harp on risk to revenue, risk to revenue, risk to revenue. You've got to make sure that you understand the financial impact and the likelihood, and you need to do some scenario modeling for sure to make sure that you understand what that is. And you need to be sure that you're looking at your ROI. And again, back to the industry benchmark, you've got to do that. And one of the things that I teach everybody is a single point on a graph doesn't mean anything. 2 points will give you a line, and that line will tell you a story. So I always want to see the risk trend analysis. What's our risk look like today? What was it yesterday? What do you project it to be tomorrow? Simple stuff like that, just very simple. And again, when you look at risk to revenue, you want to be able to do this annualized loss expectancy. If you can't tell me for a specific vulnerability what the ALE is, you're not doing your job. Every CISO needs to be able to come up with the ALE for every vulnerability. They need to be able to show they've identified the vulnerability. They've taken steps to either mitigate or accept the risk, and they need to understand what the result of either one of those actions is, and that's the ALE. It's not just downtime, incident response, and that sort of thing. You've got to understand what your annualized loss is going to be. That speaks to the board. Telling the board, yeah, we're going to lose $50 million. That gets their attention. Just telling them, hey, we've got a vulnerability, and if we don't patch it, bad things could happen. They're like, well, okay, what bad things? Bad things can happen to who? To us. Are we going to have bad things? There's really a communication that has to happen in numbers. Use numbers. And this I give you a cautionary on the cyber insurance utilization. All cybersecurity insurance policies today have a list of things, just like NIST standards or ISO standards. They've got a list of framework within that policy of things that you have to do, activities that you have to either be engaged in, software that you need to be running. And they're not going to give you a specific software. They'll just say, you've got to have vulnerability management software. Okay, great. What is that? How much does it cost? That sort of thing. But that insurance policy is going to have a list of things that you need to be able to tick off, or if you try to use it, you're probably not going to get there from here. They're getting very picky and saying, well, you all didn't do your job like you should have, so we don't have to pay. You just have to remember which side you're on. Cyber insurance is there, yes, to protect the organization, but the insurance company's management is responsible for not paying it. I mean, that's why they're there, to not pay claims. They want to take in the revenue from your policy, whether it's a rider or whatever, but their job is to mitigate the loss that they have to pay. And it's real easy in cyber to miss 2 or 3 things on that list. So when you go to get a policy, list out everything you've got to do and make sure you're doing it. And if you're not doing it, that needs to go to the board. We've got to do these things or our cyber insurance is not going to be honored. And again, when you look to risk to revenue, you want to look at all the things on the right, the threat, whether it's ransomware, data breach, insider threat, what's the likelihood of it happening? What's your estimated loss? How much are you shelling out for mitigation? What's your mitigation cost? And then what's your risk reduction? So we can take something like a ransomware attack that has a 40% likelihood, and we can reduce the risks by 60%. That speaks to the board. That speaks to your senior management team. And what risks? We always want you to look at the score. We always want the strategic, compliance, operational, reputational, and economic. And today, if you don't throw in the technological risk, you're going to have a problem. Remember AI, it's with us. It's not going away. It's only going to be used more and more for good and for evil. So, take that technological risk to heart. And make sure that your report to the board, if you're a CISO, is clear, concise, and focused. Remember, most boards, even for a small to medium-sized organization, are going to have, I don't know, anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 pages of information that they should be reading for their board meeting. And, we don't do the 3-inch, 3-ring binders full of stuff for every board member anymore. We put everything out on a tablet. Well, guess what? Every time you automate something like that, the number of pages goes way up. So what used to be 1,000 pages a month is probably going to be 2,000 pages because we don't have to print it out. We can just put it in the board packet. You can see where that gets really tedious for board members, really tedious. And you've got to remember when you're reporting that human factors engineering is important. What a report looks like matters more than you can ever imagine. Use charts and graphs. Remember, a single point doesn't tell the story, but a line does. And what you look like matters. When you're presenting to the board, you need to look sharp. You don't need to go in there in cargo shorts and a t-shirt. That's not going to be how you present to the board. You need to make sure that if the board wears a suit, you're wearing a suit. If they're in business casual, you're in business casual. Those sorts of things are important. If we look at just a very simple board report, you're going to do an overview. Your executive summary is going to be like this. You're going to be doing this overview: key risks, ongoing initiatives, security threat landscape, what's your recent threats, your industry specific risks. The finance industry has different risks than oil and gas. So make sure your industry specific risks are identified. And you've got to do your internal risk assessment findings. And you're going to have to do something like this, where you have a threat landscape over the year. You're going to have to show them what phishing attacks, malware, ransomware, and insider threats are. Now, while insider threats are low, they're the pink line at the bottom, I promise you, they're the ones that'll gig you the hardest, because employees still to this day believe it's a moral imperative that they zip up all the information they can and take it with them when they leave the company. Uh, that can have some direct impact if they're taking customer lists, financial information, that sort of thing. You want to make sure that you've covered those insider threats. And you want to look at your security incident breakdown. What are you going to get from malware? What are your insider threats? Notice the insider threats are bigger than malware. Ransomware. Well, ransomware really today, more than anything, relates to that insider threat. It's almost like you could add the 15 and the 30, because ransomware today, 98% of the time, is initiated from somebody clicking on something they shouldn't, whether it's on a website, in an email, whatever. So that's why you see the number for phishing being so high. Phishing will get you a lot of clicks, and clicks don't translate well. They're going to end up taking you someplace you shouldn't go. And you want to do your key metrics for your cybersecurity program. And that relates directly to where your compliance status is and what recent security investments you should be making. This is our posture. These are our key metrics. This is how we dial those into our compliance requirements. And these are the projects that we've got underway. This is our current investment. And you want to do an example of your current security posture and show them where you are. Now, if you notice, I blew that number. 85 should really be 60, because we lost 25 on security education, training, and awareness. So I need to fix that number. But this gives you an example of the chart that you would use for something like that. The financial impact in millions of dollars, legal fees, downtime. Notice the big one, data breach. That's simply because last time I was at a small bank, and we had something that we perceived to be a data breach, but we couldn't really tell. Management decided that they are going to replace all of the debit cards. Okay, great. So every one of our customers got a new debit card that ended up costing about $2.60 each to get out to the customer all in. Well, it doesn't take long at $2.60 per customer to realize that you just spent a chunk of change on something that you could have probably mitigated the risk of and not had to do, if that makes sense. And you want to make sure that you hit your major initiatives. What are your ongoing security projects? What are your upcoming initiatives? What are your incident response improvements? Remember, incident response is a way of life. You got to be doing it. You got to be doing tabletops on it. You got to be practicing. The senior management team and the board has to be involved in those activities. That's just, common sense. Although a lot of boards don't see it that way. Your cybersecurity budget allocation versus your estimated cost savings. Simple chart. Threat intelligence, we're saving $3 million by investing $1.25 million. Employee training, incident response, third-party risk, cloud security. All those are important and should be categorized in dollars and cents by this is what we're budgeting for this area, and this is the cost we've estimated we're going to save. And all that should be able to be quantified when you calculate your annualized loss expectancy. That's where all that detail comes back. And you have to have some recommended next steps. And normally, zero trust is kind of a new concept. And basically, it means we don't trust anybody that's going to touch our network, that's going to attach to it, that's going to log into it, or anything. We want to identify them. We want to make sure that they're one of our people or somebody that's supposed to be there. And we want to make absolutely certain that they have access to all the information they need, but only the information that they need. If we're not doing that one thing, you need to stop right there and fix that. That's the first thing you need to fix. Random people should not be able to attach to your network for any reason. And if you think about it, the last time I logged into my brokerage account, they did 3 or 4 different things to make sure that it was me. And if I screwed up on one of them, they were sending me texts saying, "Did you do this? Is this you?" So that zero trust cannot be overstressed. AI-driven threat detection and expansion. Yeah, AI threats are coming. We just haven't seen a lot of them, but you can use AI for threat detection. And it's just like when Spectre and Meltdown came out several years ago. Nobody had a fix for it. So everybody had to rely on the measures that they had in place to keep the organization safe. If there's not a fix for a threat, identifying it's one thing. Okay, it's a vulnerability. Yeah, we got it. So is everybody else. Nothing we can do about it. No software fix at this time. Unfortunately, the software fixes for Spectre and Meltdown crushed the file servers that were vulnerable and made them look like they weren't running. They were running so slow. But that was a CPU-driven piece of malware that I don't believe was ever operationalized. I believe it was just identified as a vulnerability, and everybody more or less overreacted to it. But if you've got AI-driven threat detection, you can expand that and say, yeah, we've got this, but we're doing these 12 things to keep the bad guys out. So we don't really have that much exposure to that vulnerability. Your improved cloud security measures. What are you doing to enhance your cloud security controls? Cloud security controls today and cloud encryption are huge because every once in a while, for reasons that we just don't explain real well, especially if you're talking to the board, you're not going to be able to explain it real well. But for reasons that are totally explainable to a technical person, totally unexplainable to a non-technical person, your cloud containers will sometimes fail, and that leaves that container open to anybody that's in the cloud. That's something you've got to have software to be able to detect the failure and repair the failure and make sure that you're firewalled off so that you don't have any real data breaches or data losses. But those things, when we start talking about it, even just in this little explanation I've had, if you're not a technical person, is stuff's going over your head and you're going, I have no idea what he's talking about. What's a container? How did it get breached? That kind of thing. But you've got to find a way to show the board that you are recognizing that as a threat, what you've done to mitigate any vulnerabilities that might exist, and how you're going to dial in the dollars and cents to make sure that it doesn't happen. Your regulatory alignment goes without saying. If you're in oil and gas, FERC is going to be off on you. And also, you're going to have, thanks to the Department of Homeland Security, you're going to have some things that you have to do in the oil and gas industry that you didn't have to do before that directly relate to new governance, risk, and compliance measures. And one of the things that we see in the regulatory environment is the finance industry, thanks to the 2008-2009 meltdown, got to be one of the most overregulated environments in the world. But everything that the regulatory bodies were asking banks, credit unions, mortgage lenders, anybody in the finance industry, insurance companies, all those industry giants to do were just sound business practices. It wasn't really like they were asking for them to do something that was nonsensical. They were asking for sound business practices, sound security measures. But what we saw was all of a sudden, oh, the federal government says if we're going to define that for finance, we should also use that in healthcare. Wouldn't that be great? And then we got the high trust matrix or the high trust framework then. And the high trust framework gives you a way to align what you're doing with cybersecurity and with your technology environment, with the regulatory environment that HIPAA and HIPAA High Tech created. And again, we've talked about cyber insurance. You've got to give them a valuation of where you are on your insurance. Yes, we've got insurance. No, we may not need to use it. But if we do, we've got to make sure that these steps have been taken so that the policy will still be valid, that kind of thing. And you always want to give the board action items. Approve the budget, endorse your zero trust initiatives, support the recruitment of additional cybersecurity professionals, promote awareness, and you always want to say, this is the end of the report, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you want to ask. Make sure that everything you do when you close out is not just, okay, I'm done, we're gone, bye. This is the end of this report. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to provide any answers. If you want to do it one-on-one, I completely understand. I'll make myself available. That's really where you want to go with these things. You want to give them a conclusion, a very simple conclusion that shows them exactly where you are in a summary form. You made a lot of progress. Continued investment and vigilance is still required. Bad guys didn't go away yesterday. And your support as a board is a key resource. You want to leave them with those things. And questions, comments? I guess I can stop sharing now.
Well, Gordon, I say keep your contact information up on the screen.
Okay, all right. Well,
I
we'll go
think
back to
that's
share.
useful so everyone can see. Um, so I do have some questions. I actually wrote a list of questions and
Okay.
comments down, and that kind of correspond to what I encounter when I talk to board members. So one question, how do you actually calculate your organization's expected loss? That seems to me a very challenging thing to do. So I could look at my revenue, what industry I'm in, how heavily regulated, and maybe I could go search for similarly situated organizations, same industry that have had a cyber incident. Can you give any suggestion if you're a CISO? How can you calculate that? And whom should you enlist in the organization to help you make that calculation?
Well, you always, when you're doing numbers, you always want to use the CFO. Your
Okay.
CFO is a great resource for you. But what you've got to do is take every vulnerability that you have and run it through a matrix of what's the probability it's going to occur.
Yeah. So I guess a question would be,
Let me go
how do
back
I
here.
even get, how do I even calculate the probability? That's the challenge. Like, is
Right.
there a resource I consult? Is there, an industry benchmark I can consult? I know a lot of CISOs who don't know how to get started, on that. They want to
Okay.
in good faith, but a board, let's say that
Right.
you have a very high risk, high probability of occurrence, you know,
Me.
and the impact is major or catastrophic. And the board says, well, how do you know? What's the data backing that up? Prove it to me.
I get it. Let me show you kind of a starter.
Okay.
I'm hoping you can still see this screen here.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay. This matrix example. All right. Let me make this bigger for you. Okay. Let's see. Where are we at here? All right. There's 100%. All right. If you look at this, can you read the numbers? I guess is the main
Not
thing.
quite, not quite. But if you make it
Okay.
bigger,
Let's
I
just
think
keep
we
getting
can.
bigger till we can read the numbers.
Yeah.
All right. This is the top half that we've already seen.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, is it a rare, less than 10% of a chance it's going to occur? Or on the high end, is there greater than the 70% chance? And I always try and break things down into these categories as far as the failure probability.
Mm-hmm.
The consequence or the severity, I stick with the standard. I still use catastrophic, which, yeah, given my history, I probably shouldn't. But and then you look at these four categories rather. You look at people, facilities, systems, and operations, and you look at what could happen with the people. Is there a risk of injury? First aid, lost time accident, partial disability, total disability. And that's really part of the overall risk calculation that you're always going to make. In technology, you're really never probably going to have any one of these partial disability or total disabilities, but you've got to take that into consideration because that's part of an organization's overall risk number, their overall risk posture. And then
Mhm.
look at your facilities. What is the damage? Minor, localized, the whole thing's destroyed. And when you get down to your technology, to your systems, you look at your RTO and RPO. If your RTO is greater than 2 days and your RPO is greater than 2 days, well, that's not a big deal,
Mhm.
most organizations. But if you think about it, your
Mhm.
time, and what we're talking about here is just the time it takes you to get operational after an incident. If you look at the time it takes to get you operational after an incident, you're going to start getting some dollars that you can calculate because every organization has a run rate. What is the organization's run rate? How much does it cost the organization to operate every day? Well, let's say, just to keep the numbers simple, it costs $1 million for the organization to run every day, and the organization takes in 2 million every day. So if they're down for 2 days, they lose $4 million. Is
Mhm.
that material? Yeah, it depends on
Yep.
the organization,
Yep.
that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And the old, especially when you're looking at operational hours, the old adage, and it's still true, and technology people have been saying this for 3 decades. So, bear with me on this one. But if we turn off HR for a week, let's go ahead and turn it off and let's see if anybody notices. Let's take our systems down for an hour and see how many people get fired. And
Mhm.
that's really a direct result of that operational loss that you're going to have. HR, if they're down for a week, you're not going to lose any money, you're just not. You turn off your website for a week, especially if you're doing sales across it, you got a problem. Can you imagine what Amazon would lose if their website went down? I mean, if you think about it, Amazon does something like $6.7 million a minute
Mhm.
in revenue.
Mhm.
Okay, well, let's turn it off for an hour. Well, that's
Mhm.
6.7 times 60. That's a chunk of change. And look
Mhm.
at the reputation hit that Amazon would get.
Mhm.
Everybody laughed at Bezos when he took so long to build his system so tough and so robust and so scalable. And he spent hundreds of, literally billions, in creating those systems. But look at the revenue engine he created.
Mhm.
Now that revenue engine cannot afford to go down for any reason.
Yes.
So that's a real different man. And then when you look at the financial side, I always look at the operating costs and all these different environments. And for every organization, it's different. This is why you have to have your chief financial officer involved. And then when you look at your security requirements, we're always on the CIA triangle:
Yep.
confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
Mhm.
And you want to make sure that they're in line with where the organization is. We may have a lot of integrity in our data, but it's not that confidential. Everybody can get to it. One
Mhm.
of the things that I always like to do is, there's a couple of vendors out there that have software that'll tell you who's accessed what files, and you have to install the software and then go through and categorize the files. And usually the ones in the finance organization, the finance side of the organization, are the ones that everybody's interested in, because all of a sudden you'll see Mary pop up once a month wanting to access some finance file. And the question always comes like, why is Mary accessing that? And it's like, well, the controller's got Mary working on this, and that file is part of this, so she has to have access to it. And then the senior management team will look at the controller and say, why aren't you doing that? You know, you always
Yeah.
have these kinds of things that pop out when you start looking at where the data is and who has access to it. But that's
Mhm.
really what we're talking about in the security requirements. Where's your data? Who can access it? Who can actually change it? It's a different thing to have read-only rights, but if you can actually make a change to that data, there's something else that's in there. And then,
Mhm.
this table, the risk assessment index, will show
Mhm.
you the numbers in the firefall, that's a firefall diagram, will show you what's acceptable, what's manageable, and what's acceptable after review.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
those kinds of things. But this is really where you start. You start breaking it down. Then you take an individual vulnerability and run it through a matrix. And I don't know that we have, no, we don't have one of those on there. But that is just quite simply, that's the back end of this, the work that you have to do to get up to something like that. And
Hmm.
what you're trying to do is always come back to a number. What's my number? How much money am I going to lose? How much downtime am I going to have?
Hmm. Gordon, another question, and I have so many. This is a rich conversation, and I'm looking
Okay.
forward to having more. I encounter board members and corporate officers who perceive that AI and AI agents can essentially replace their cybersecurity teams and their information security teams. Of course, I completely disagree with that, but there is that perception, and we see it in the
Yeah.
press. You know, we see where CEOs of major businesses have said, well, for all new hires, you first have to provide a reason why AI can't do it first to the exclusion of future human employees. And that's going to be in the cybersecurity area. If you're a CISO and your board or your CEO makes that statement, what do you do?
Well, I would simply ask, well, what are you going to do with the errors?
Uh-huh.
And
Hmm.
they're going to say errors. What errors? And it's like, well, AI is created with what we refer to as large language models, which basically means they have a finite set of information that they can draw from.
Hmm.
And they're also going to go out to the
Hmm.
web. I mean, every AI model I know is going to scour the web as well as take the data sets that they've been given and draw some conclusions.
Hmm.
Well, is everything you find on the web when that AI model goes out and scrubs it, is all that information accurate? You know,
Yep.
what is accurate and what is not accurate?
Yep.
And then where are you going to get the false positives? One of the
Hmm.
things I worked with a few months back was there was an organization that contacted me and said, we want to do all our hiring and we want to use AI to sort through the resumes. It's like, okay, great. Tee it up. Let's test it. And we ran a test and I showed the company how I could submit a resume and fool the AI model into thinking I was the top candidate, no matter
Hmm.
what.
Hmm.
All I had to do was feed the model the right information, and I
Hmm.
popped up to be the number one person for the job. Woohoo! You
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
that kind of thing.
Hmm. Hmm.
So they had to say, okay, well, we can use AI to filter to a certain level, but then a human has to take over. Somebody's got to actually sit down and take it over. And all AI models can be fooled. Every
Hmm.
AI model out there is going to make mistakes.
Hmm.
That's why if you look at Duke University's AI model that they run with IBM on cancer diagnostics, the model today is only 4% better than a human at diagnosing cancer,
Hmm.
specific causes, specific types, and that sort of thing. And in healthcare, 4% means a lot to those folks. You know,
Hmm.
that's a significant increase, but it also has some interesting false positives
Hmm.
that physicians still have to take a look at and say, you know, I don't know why the model's saying that. I don't think that can be right.
Yep.
And, you know, those things are going to happen. AI is not mature enough yet to just turn something over and leave it. And
Hmm.
bear in mind, every AI model that I know of, that I'm aware of, is going to take at least 6 months worth of, after you get it set up and running, which is going to take at least 3 months, it's going to take 6 more months to have enough data go through it that you can fine tune the false positives and the false negatives to a
Hmm.
point that it's actually operational. So
Hmm.
you've got to be able to not only afford the model, but be able to run it for 9 months before you're going to get any value out of it.
Hmm.
And when you look at the cost, a lot of organizations go, I don't know that we really want to make that change.
Hmm. Another question I have, we talk about insider threats. Um, Board members are insider threats to some
Oh,
extent.
yeah, and big
So I'll
way.
give you an example. So board members very frequently are on minimum 2 or 3 boards, sometimes 4 boards. Uh, Many board members are using personal smartphones, personal laptops to do board work for more than one board. If you're a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, and you have personal liability or potential personal liability for breaches, and the source and that part of your threat landscape comes from the use of personal devices by board members and board members being on multiple boards where the threat or attack could come from uh, another business they're a board member of, but it flows into yours. What do you do as a CISO? It's a politically sensitive environment. You know, the CEO who interacts with the board might be uncomfortable approaching the board. How do you manage that as a CISO if that's a real threat?
Well, the first thing that everybody wants to do is issue the board a tablet that's got some
Yep.
security software on there. So that's normally how, as a CISO, you fix the problem. You give them
Yep.
a tablet that's got security software on it, and all employees, including board members that want to use their phone, get a similar piece of security software on their phone that
Hmm.
authenticates them anytime they come into the system, back to that zero trust. We don't trust anybody, even board members. We
Right.
can't,
Right.
to your point, we can't trust board members for 2 reasons. One, they don't understand anything about cybersecurity as a rule,
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
universally.
Hmm.
And two, they're prone to leave their stuff somewhere, and I can't
Hmm.
tell you how many board members have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 as their password to their tablets. So
Hmm. Hmm.
it's not real secure, but you want that
Hmm.
software on there so that you can actually wipe that device when it gets lost, and it will. But if they insist on using their personal tablet, then the only thing you can do is get with the CISOs and the other organizations that they're board members of and say, what software are you putting on those tablets to secure them? Are you using Duo? What is your platform of choice here? Your control mechanism to control the platform and the data on it. If you can come to some agreement, that's great. Otherwise, I'm always going to suggest, well, just issue them a different tablet for every board and they can manage it. But
Hmm. Hmm.
the larger the organization, the less likely you're going to win that argument.
Right.
The
Right.
larger the organization, the more likely they're going to say it's not a big deal. They can do
Right.
whatever they want.
Right. Understood. Understood. Gordon, we've reached the end of the hour. I certainly want to thank you for all these rich insights. It's been very interesting. I certainly have more questions and discussion points, and you're automatically invited for future webinars to go deeper into
Thank
that.
you.
And just thank you again for your time today.